Hey, this is Benjamin Boyce. Happy Ramadan to you if you're participating. If not, happy quarantine. And if you're not participating in that, well, I hope the Twitter mobs aren't disturbing you for all the mockery of your non-quarantine practices. So YouTube is now giving me the ability to rate the appropriateness of my content. And they say, this is what they say, that if I am honest, they're going to check my answers, going to check my videos. If I'm honest with my videos, then I will have an easier time or a less likelihood of just randomly getting demonetized. So the review of the video involves me going through and answering a list of questions. I could go through all those, but I'm not really concerned with all the different things. The most interesting thing for me is the sub-chapter, the sub-questions titled Hateful Content. Content likely to offend a marginalized individual or group. Trying to figure out whether or not any given evergreen episode, which you know about and I kind of know probably more than you about by now, it's really difficult to figure out, under these circumstances, under this particular circumstance of the spring of 2017 at the Evergreen State College, what counts as a marginalized group. The white male within the campus of the Evergreen State College, maybe to this day, but certainly in 2017, when I was there, over the course of my time there, the white male was openly berated. The white male was the marginalized group on campus. If you were a white male on campus, you were expected to take one for the team. You were expected to apologize for your patriarchy, or to be silent, or to step back. I had a professor tell me to be less involved in class so that another person could be involved more in that class. Turns out I was a white male and the other student was a black female, and it wasn't until 2 years later that I saw my professor going off in something that can be completely described as a church service, my professor going off on how white people need to check their privilege.
When faculty aren't trained to address dynamics of inequality in classrooms, we expose students of color to oppression, and white students can't learn to examine their own racism and white fragility.
Watching her go off on all that white fragility stuff, which she bought hook, line, and sinker from Robin DiAngelo, made me very aware in that moment that the white male is marginalized on the Evergreen State College campus. And when they go and they further define hateful content as content likely to offend a marginalized individual or group, what is the definition of marginalized? Is it within the context of what? Of the world? Or of America, or of this state, or of this college? At every tier of the position, at every tier of context, there's a different positionality of what is defined as marginalized. So if you're going to give marginalized people the ability to be offended by anything or weight the offense quotient by whosoever is marginalized enough to be offended by it, then what you're doing is incentivizing marginalization, self-marginalization at that, which is a running theme through a lot of the politics that I've gone into over the last 3 years since leaving the Evergreen State College. So how do I go and answer honestly with these 3 questions? First question. References to a marginalized group that are made in a non-hurtful manner as part of a public debate or comedic context. Now, in my last video, which was about George Bridges giving the protesters as much as he could and the protesters being upset that the news media didn't like them, or society at large didn't like them, but they blame the media, or they blame Brett Weinstein for going to the media when they, in fact, are the ones who published everything themselves. By which I mean, if you're an Evergreen State College protester just tuning in, to publish means to make public. They were the ones who went public first, and they blamed the negative reaction on Brett Weinstein, Fox News, all this other stuff. So they were referencing their blackness within the context that I guess YouTube would read. YouTube, in and of itself, is the one who's going to be judging what is marginalized group. Don't forget that. I guess that's the whole point of this whole episode. YouTube is the one who gets to define this subjective term marginalized. So if YouTube sees black people talking about black suffering, that's fine. That's a public debate and it's being referenced. So just referencing a marginalized group is not bad as long as there is a public debate or a comedic context. This is the problem with censorship. The only people who really get off on censorship are people without senses of humor. Comedy, in and of itself, is something that plays around with meaning. Censors want meaning to be stable. Censorship, in and of itself, it's a false idea because it perceives meaning as to be something that could be stabilized. And it's not. Insofar as a censor gets their way, the ground will erode under them, by which I mean the way in which people will use language will develop so that they can have the freedom to make the statements that they need to make with the tools available to them. So a censor is always going to be going around after the fact and defining what is a proper term, what is an improper term. So it's hilarious to me in a certain respect that they're allowing for this comedic clause to occur with regards to references of a marginalized group when that clause, that escape route, that caveat will be decided by them too. So they're going to decide what is a marginalized group, and then they're going to decide what is a comedic context. And where does comedy end and abuse begin? That's a subjective line. I mean, I know it when I see it. I know it when I feel it out. I try to avoid that, but I still need to be funny. You got to be funny, so you got to be a little bit mean. Second question, content that may be offensive to a marginalized group, but is used for education, news, or a documentary. Now, the first one I clicked, the second one I clicked just to see what would happen, and it instantly demonetized me. Imagining what YouTube, whoever's deciding what YouTube believes with regards to what is a marginalized group, with regards to the Evergreen State College story, they would say that the black people are the marginalized group, even though they have all the power on the campus at that point. They're still the marginalized group because the context just shifts to make them marginalized, even though within that local context, they have all the power. If you just shift your view, then they don't have any power whatsoever. Or the massive tide of negative feedback is going to marginalize them within a few hours or a few days of the footage hitting the internet. So it's really hard to even explain this. What does offensive mean, right? Who decides offensive? And it's not even that it's something that's offensive and something that's marginalized. So it's not even just that which is offensive to the marginalized group, but what may be offensive to the marginalized group. That completely negates that comedic context. A lot of comedy is offensive. A lot of comedy might be offensive too. So you just swallowed up the comedic context clause and shoved it into, well, we can revert it back because that might be offensive to somebody. This is so soupy, it doesn't make any sense. And which is fine. It's fine that things don't make sense. But then they use the word hateful content to describe this. Hateful is a very strong word, and they're making that word, hateful, mean whatever they want it to mean. So hate no longer has a value whatsoever. That is the problem with going down this supercilious, censorious, subjective route. It just completely demolishes the meaning of anything. Third question, hate or discrimination toward a protected group based on race, age, or other natural characteristics. So if you have hate or discrimination toward a protected group, what does that mean? Legally, that means you can't judge people based on their immutable characteristics. That's what is protected. It's not certain characteristics that are protected. It's characteristics themselves. You're not allowed legally, you're not allowed to hire people based on their race. Race is protected. That means you can't go there. It doesn't mean that certain races are protected and certain aren't. That's the problem with that language. So hate or discrimination toward a protected group based on race, age, or other natural characteristics. It's interesting that they did not put sex in there, because now it may be offensive to a marginalized group that sex is a characteristic and not gender is a characteristic. Sex is going by the wayside. So this way of thinking erodes everything. And how do I answer honestly? How do you be honest whatsoever with this sort of questionnaire? You can't. You have to, this is like somebody stuck in a mental institution that just has to figure out what the doctors want to hear. It's a complete guessing game, and it's going to change depending on one censor or another censor, one reviewer, another reviewer, one administration, another administration. And to be honest, it's not just YouTube's fault. They have a lot riding on them. Sorry about the lawn day, but they have a lot riding on this. There's a lot of money involved. I understand that you have to do something for a business, and I understand they're a private company. They can do whatever they want. I'm here by the grace of YouTube. I'm shuffled into your viewer by the grace of YouTube. I understand that. It's just this entire mode of judging content is suspicious from the get-go, and it doesn't really work out because it's open to abuse, to whoever can claim to be marginalized, or to whoever can claim to be acting on behalf of the marginalized, whether the marginalized want it or not. All right, we'll just end with the weed whacker. You guys have a good night. Bye.